Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's getting cold outside, which could be a good or bad thing depending on how you look at it, but there's some of the best fishing all year to be had this time of year, and it's usually when a lot of guys start to put up their fishing rods for the season and wait till next spring. But today I'm going to be covering bass patterns, habits, locations, and tips on how you can catch more bass this winter out on Lake of the Ozarks. Before I dive into that, if you are new to the channel and you fish Lake of the Ozarks or you want to become a better angler, you should consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss new lake breakdowns and fishing content. If you are already a subscriber, thank you for your support. It helps me keep going to bring you content like this. Alright, let's dive into this thing. Bass move from shallow fall feeding areas as temperature drops and bait fish move back out along creek channels and points to their wintering locations. This process starts in early winter to late fall, depending on weather patterns and water temperature. Water temperature is key to their movements. Bass are cold-blooded and their peak metabolism and activity happens in the 50s and 60s, and once that temperature falls into the lower 50s and 40s, the bass are no longer as active and they become lethargic and locked into more stable and relatively warm water and wintering locations. Today I'm starting us off up here on the upper Osage arm of the lake. I'm going to zoom out here real quick so you guys can see where I'm at. Truman Lake is actually over here on the left side of your screen, and the rest of the main lake is further out towards the right side. So I'm going to come back here to the back of this cove here and show you guys where these fish are going to be coming from once they start leaving their areas in the fall. Back of the shallow areas are where the shad starts to pile up in the fall. Once the water temperature starts to cool off, those bass start to move back out of those feeding flats where those bait fish are. As they move and water becomes colder, they move out along the creek channels and the points. In this area of the lake, there's a lot more creek channels than just points. I'm going to give you some examples of every arm of the lake and how they kind of fish differently. Areas that I would like to look for would be like right along these tight contours over here on the right. Each one of these lines represents a depth change, and the tighter those are is the faster that water changes. And so I want to fish those steeper banks, not shallower gradient slopes over here to the left side of this cove, but more along the old creek beds. I want to kind of fish those different swings, and as it pushes up here along this bank, it kind of goes down. Those are going to be key areas and where those bass are going to move along this cove here like a highway. And this becomes more of a shallower area on my right in this area, and the old creek actually follows right along over here and slams into this. As we follow this thing out here towards the main channel, it opens up and becomes a lot deeper out here. You can see this is about 43 feet out here, 52 feet over here. And over here, it's actually still pretty shallow. It's actually old flat, and the creek channel kind of splits it between these two flats here and then moves right against this bank over on this side where these lines are tighter. And on topo maps, that's what I'm going to be looking for, the tight lines for old creek channels and things to locate those areas that bass are going to move along as they migrate out. And as you can see here on this satellite image here of when it was taken into winter, when the lake is drawn down, you can see actually how shallow it is. I want to be fishing areas over here where that blue line is visible and there's no land sticking out past it, because those are going to be your sharper breaks and going to be more productive for where those fish are going to sit, because the warmer water is actually going to be in the deeper areas. This shallow area over here is a lot more turbulent, and the bait fish have moved out along with those other bass during the fall period out to these sections. So any of the active fish are going to be out along these sections. So that's an example of an area up here on the upper Osage. I'm going to take you guys down here to a separate section of the lake. We're here towards mid-lake. A lot more coves and stuff. The old river channel is still there, but it's significantly deeper. This is in the 70s and 80s out here in the main channel. I'm going to take you guys over here to Lynn Creek Cove. Out here in the back, there's a big shallow flat, as you can see by the darker blue, and it starts to come back out, and the lighter blue is indicating a deeper channel. So I'll zoom in here so you guys can see this a little bit better. There's actually the old channel, the old creek bed right here, and an old bridge that comes up over here. And this is where the old creek channel kind of runs right along this bank. And this bank over here would be an area I would target as these fish are moving out, and they would use this as a highway, a steeper bank and everything. They kind of run these old channels out. It kind of comes back in contact over here and all on this bank, and it's a little bit steeper. It's in the 20s, which is good. And there's a shallow pocket right off of here as well, which is important for active fish to slide up and feed on warmer days. And as these fish are moving out, those key holding areas are still going to be within the creek channels, but where those creek channels and the old main river channels hit these points and kind of become more steeper banks along some of these, those are going to be key holding areas for bass during the wintertime and where they're going to be moving out to. Different types of points attract different fish. Some fish move out to the main channel and some remain in coves. Fish will winter in bigger coves, especially like Lynn Creek Cove here where the water's plenty deep enough. You have steeper contours all along here and different points and secondary points for them to stage up on. A lot more of the fish tend to move out and migrate towards the main river channel in the upper arms like I showed you guys earlier, and some of the deeper coves and stuff towards the lower and mid-lake sections tend to hold fish more regularly throughout the winter, and you can catch them as far back as almost towards the end where I showed you guys where that creek channel was in Lynn Creek Cove over here. It's plenty deep enough to hold fish even in the wintertime. It's fairly long. Bass feed in short periods, usually in the afternoon or the warmer sections of the day where the sun's beating down, in areas with near deep by water access. As temperature rises in the day, the sun hits rocks up shallow, heating those areas up just enough to pull bass up onto the rocks and make bait fish and crawfish more active. Bass will almost actually sun themselves like a snake would on those rocks at times because they retain some heat, especially like the darker colored ones. Fish come up for a short time to feed and then return to the deeper water nearby. Bass eats lots of crayfish during this time of year because they're close into those rocks, and that's where the crayfish are. They like those old creek channels because they have bigger chunk rocks for them to hide in, and that's just kind of where they live year round. And you might be finding fish in the back third over here along some of these creek channels, closer back here. And other days they might be out here in the middle of the cove or off some of these bigger secondary points that kind of come along near the creek channels or where there's deeper water access nearby. Wind blowing in on points always kind of congregates bait fish as it blows around the plankton that the bait fish eat on, like shad. They eat a lot of plankton, which then brings in the bass to feed, triggers on a hot bite for just a short period of time. And if you can get there in the right window, it can be very, very effective for you. And some fish will actually still move out to the main channel. It's a lot trickier to fish, but I look for little pockets that are up off of those cliffs and things where maybe some rubble has fallen down and it's created a small shelf where there's some big black rocks. Crayfish like to hide in them. Shad will come up and feed on them during the warmer sections of the day, and the bass will move up there to feed as well, especially if you get a little bit of wind coming out here. And you guys are going to have to kind of experiment with the wind and where the bait are going to be, and that'll kind of help you figure out where the bass are, but just experiment wherever fish are day to day because they can move around and they might be active in one area for a couple hours one day, and then the next day a cold front comes in and they move locations and they're further out deep. And I like to divide off some of these bigger coves to help me find fish and pattern them by dividing this up into thirds. So I take like the first third out here towards the mouth of the cove, and if I'm catching a couple fish in here, that's good and all, but then if I come back here in the second third and I light it up, then I know to be running that same kind of pattern, looking for those kind of depths and moving more into the middle of the cove to catch some of these fish. It's just kind of something I use to help myself cover water and eliminate water to help me pattern fish and get on more of a consistent bite. We want to keep covering water to find active fish that have pulled up shallow. Then once you find them, take notes of where you caught them, whether it be at the mouth of the cove, a secondary point, a main channel, and if you are in a cove where it was the 1/3, 2/3, or 3/3 of the way back into the cove. I'm going to take you guys up here along the Niangua. You guys can see just kind of similarities between this and the upper Osage. Not quite as deep overall once you get up here because it's not the Osage River, and the Osage River was deeper than this section. As you can see, it's 19 feet out here where the old river channel is, and it comes up right next to this cliff over here where it's steeper, and this would be a section I would target over here. The coves are so shallow and more like flats good for fall but not for winter that I don't even bother going in them. It's kind of that way the further up you go on some of these arms. A good section over here again, as you can see, I'm looking for those darker lines, more and more of a cliff area, and then right on this point over here be a key area to target as well for those fish to be coming out of this channel up here to feed during a warmer section of the day and move back down to the depths. Here we find about 20 feet of water, and it comes up very fast with these contours. A little bit of a bend here. Any kind of current coming through here is going to bring in more and more bait fish, and if they get a little bit of wind on here as well, those are going to be key holding areas for fish this time of year. And along some of these bluffs, like I'll come down here further to Bull Run Bluff, along this section here I fish quite often. You'll actually see there's some different shades of blue right there, and those are actually rubble sections where the cliffs have kind of caved in, or there's some rock that's fallen off and it's created like a very small shelf. The shelf might only be a few feet wide, and it kind of provides a little bit of a sanctuary for some bait fish, And it's perfect for these bass to come out of this water that's in the 30s here, slide up and eat, and then go right back down into the depths after they get their meal. And you can find sections like that all over these bluffs on the Niangua. A lot of times these pockets are here and that rubble is there because there's been erosion, and that comes from rain runoff. And if you have a warmer rain that comes in, it can heat up that water right by this section of this cliff and bring those fish out of the depths really fast because it's slightly warmer, and that turns up the bait fish and it turns up the crawfish and makes them a lot more active. And those bass know that, and they come up and feed. If you get a little bit of warm rain runoff in there, you might have like a 50-degree rain and the waters are like in the upper 30s, and that will help bring those fish up to feed. There's a little cove over here that has got a lot of deeper contours along it. It's actually even kind of steeper here in the back, so if there's any kind of creek runoff in there, I'm not too afraid of that as well, because the river channels here, it doesn't take very much for them to kind of follow up and along some of this area here, especially if there's some different kind of transitional rock. This area out here is more of a bluff, and then as you come in, it's more of a transition to a chunky rock, which bass relate to different bottom content. Another good little area over here, big point off the main lake. A lot of deep water nearby, sharp contours, any kind of like lips that I've been talking about off the cliffs are good. This pocket over here is going to be good. I think there's some actual brush piles and stuff in here which you can catch some of those fish on some jerk baits this time of year. In the brush piles, a lot of the times you will catch crappie out of those areas, and this is just an example of a jerk bait. I like to use something that has got some suspension to it. You can add suspend strips or suspend dots if you need to modify your jerk baits for either a slower rise or a slow sink and kind of make them even suspend perfectly in the water. And these things can actually suspend right next to the brush pile or right above them. It'll draw them out as you kind of pause it there. You want to fish these jerk baits kind of slow during the winter time. I want to give them long pauses and kind of play with how you want to do your cadence and stuff. Usually like 2 pops really close to each other and giving it some slack line, and then waiting between 5 to 10 seconds is your best bet on most days. If it's really cold out and you just had a cold front, sometimes you have to go slower than that, but usually I try to go between 5 to 10 seconds, so I'm still covering some water and being able to fish. These are great around docks and brush piles where you usually catch crappie along some of those creek channels where they come in. They can draw those fish out of the cover, or you can fish these out and along the bluffs or any kind of rock, because these things just flat out catch fish this time of year. They imitate a dying shad perfectly, which in the wintertime, shad actually die off at a very fast rate, especially if we have a cold winter. Past winter in 2020 and 2021, the lake froze over and there was a massive shad kill, and jerkbaits were the way to go for the majority of the winter. This is something where you'll also catch some crappie while fishing these, but the thing about these are I want to keep these baits imitating shad colors, and you need fairly clear water to fish these baits because it's a sight bait. I don't really like fishing them when I don't have more than about 2 feet of visibility. If I got like less than a foot of visibility, I probably won't even be fishing this. I'll be going with something different. Another thing that fish like to eat a lot of this time of year, like I mentioned before, are crawfish, and they are abundant up there in the rocks. I like to kind of drag over something like a chick or craw over the tops of those rocks, or even in through like some of the laydowns, bluff banks and things that you'll find. You'll find like a cedar tree that fell in the water or something near a creek channel, and you can kind of fish this weedless through there and kind of saturate the area and slow down your presentation for those fish that are cruising right along those rocks. Catch a lot of my bass in the wintertime out of the lake on this bait. Very effective, but you don't cover as much water with this. It's kind of more of like after you find the fish or you know of a spot, I like to go and throw this around. You can do the same thing with little finesse jigs. I like to use, again, kind of more of a crawfish pattern. If you get more of a muddy water situation, you can go more to like a black or a blue that kind of sticks out and creates more of a silhouette in the muddy water so fish are even able to see it. You don't have to be as detailed with color. You just need something that's going to be dark and that they're going to be able to find in the water. And sometimes you could even put one of these on the back of a trailer, or on the back of a jig as a trailer rather, for some of these bass. I like to use these, or I like to use even some of these football headed jigs around some of this rock. You can fish these at different depths. It could be right up in the shallow sections off of those cliffs and stuff where the active bass are going to be coming up and feeding. And you can fish these even down along some of the deeper structure and deeper rock, especially if those fish are kind of in the intermediate range. Best case scenario is you don't have to slow down and use these kind of baits, and you can keep power fishing with either the jerk bait and you have some clean water, or you can use something like this, which is like a wiggle wart style crankbait, and you can cover some water that way. I like to use these things all winter long. A lot of people start to use them more in the pre-spawn, but I'll fish these. They're great for pre-spawn. They're great throughout the whole winter. You have to have somewhat of a different arsenal of colors with these. Sometimes they're better to use a natural kind of color and with some more red involved into it and some different greens and browns. But other times you want to have something that's more like this bait here, which is more of a loud color and it'll stick out more in the mud. I like to use these things in muddy water. I like to use them in covering water because they provide a lot of vibration, and it's going to pick up those active fish that are there for a short time to want to feed, and it's going to kind of set you up for where those fish are at, especially when you're just trying to first start out and you're looking for some of those spots and seeing where those active fish are. And then you can go back over the spot and kind of soak the area more with some of these jigs or crawl baits and kind of drag them over those areas where you caught those fish and pick off the last few that are maybe not quite as active in the same area. The bait that I don't really like to throw that much, but it does work, is an Alabama rig. These are the kind of baits that you want to throw out in the middle of those channels or just off to the side of them. It's going to draw those fish in because it's got so many baits, and you can have different styles. Kind of have either a bunch of swim baits on here in the back, and that's kind of it, or some of them come with blades like you can see with this one. And you tie this on. It's fairly heavy. You're going to have a heavier rod to fish this, and you really should be probably more like in a boat or kayak to go around and fish this stuff. Not really something that bank fishermen or dock fishermen I would recommend using. These things draw fish out of the brush piles as well, just because they have a lot of draw power. This is kind of how you can catch them in the open water when they're not as active. Especially I've seen guys with live scope and stuff and be able to go out and kind of see how the fish are reacting to these things, and they do come up and take them even right out of brush piles in 20 or 30 feet of water. It's kind of amazing to watch, but at the same time you got to have quite a bit of gear to go out and throw this. And the lake is an old river system that got dammed up. There's creek channels and river channels everywhere, so you don't have to come up here on the Niangua to find that. Just kind of for examples, and you can run these kind of patterns all over the lake. Fish position themselves differently on the points based on the wind, so if it's coming in straight on here from the south, they'll kind of be more positioned over here on the tip of this point. But if it's coming in here more from the west or so, they're not even going to really be over here as much, especially on this back end. Over here on this bluff, they might be more on the inside of the cove here. Going back down towards here, towards mid-lake, another area that has got a very long bluff towards it. And there's some darker blue in here, and those are going to be little rubble piles and stuff. Wind along those areas, if there's a wind coming here from the west hitting into this, it's going to position those fish and fire them up a little bit better. And if you have a wind coming off of this way from the east, that wind's not even really going to touch that cliff, and those fish are not going to be nearly as active and fired up, but they might be more fired up and more active along some of these points over here. Paying attention to where the sun's hitting, what wind direction is coming in. If you can match up the sun beating down and the wind direction on a certain area that has got some deep water access next to a shallow little rock shelf or something that those fish can come up and slide up to, is going to be very key. Speaking of wind, before storms is a good time to catch fish as they get more active with the pressure starting to drop. Wind kind of picks up during those times as well. Each arm of the lake fishes very differently based on timing and overall structure present. The upper Osage arm, both the little and big Niangua, Gravway, and Grand Glaze arm of the lake fish differently from the mid to lower lake sections just because the depths are so different. Like I'll show you up here just by how much different the colors are over here. This is more shallow compared to the more white areas down here by the dam, and it's the deepest section of the lake. And up here on the upper Gravway, how much darker blue you have. Those kind of areas, they kind of fish differently because these coves here, fish can winter out in and be residents in all year long towards the dam. They can be in some of the other coves that I showed you earlier, but further up you go towards those river arms and stuff, the more and more you're going to have to be fishing the main lake just because the coves are so much shallower. These kind of areas out here where there's 19 feet, is plenty for those fish to winter, but you also have that here almost at the back of some of these coves. So you can catch these fish kind of all the way through the cove, even in the heart of winter. As you can see here, it's still 28, 27 feet, 16, 15 feet back in here, and there's some steeper bank. You can catch these fish almost to the back. Another thing to keep in mind on the upper arms of the lakes is that they have inlets, meaning they have a creek or a river that comes in, and a lot of that comes off of farmland. So if you have like a big runoff from a heavy downpour, rain, or snow melt or something off of a winter storm, those areas up here are going to be more muddy. I've been fishing up here on the Niangua during cold fronts and stuff, and when you have a big storm come in, you have a lot of rain and the water gets muddy, those fish almost just lay down in the mud, and you almost have to like drag a bait right in front of their face for them to even know it's there, or move like a crankbait by, and it's got to go by them and they'll feel that vibration, and that'll trigger them to strike your bait. Instinctively, they're not really actively feeding at all, but they might be in those areas. Cold muddy water's not your friend. You want to try to find cleaner water. You can fish a few more baits in those situations. Okay, so I say this in all my lake breakdowns. The lower end of the lake over here is going to take the longest to either cool down or heat up depending on what time of year it is, because it's deeper, and deeper water takes longer to cool and warm. So during the winter time, this bite down here might still be in more of a fall pattern the first couple weeks that some of these upper arms over here on the lake are going to be more into a full-on winter bite, and those fish are going to be migrated back out. Up here, especially because the coves are deeper, those fish can kind of sit back in those coves, and those bait fish don't move as erratically or flock all the way back out here towards main channel, because there is no need to do that as there's deep water in the coves. These areas up here, you might actually have a winter bite going for a couple weeks or even a month ahead of time before anything down here towards the last couple miles of the lake on the Osage arm become into a winter pattern and a winter feeding mode for those bass. I know I've been rambling a lot this video, so thank you guys for staying and watching this video to the end. I'm going to wrap this up here so I can go out and catch some fish myself. If you enjoyed this in-depth breakdown over bass patterns on the Lake of the Ozarks, leave a thumbs up down below on this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new lake breakdowns and bass fishing content on Lake of the Ozarks and around the state of Missouri. If you have any questions or video suggestions for what you would like to see next on this channel, leave a comment down below. I appreciate all of you. Have a good day, and we'll catch you next time.